It was the officer's final wish, to see his K9 one last time. Officer Mark Williams, once a hero on the streets, now lay in a hospital bed, battling a terminal illness that had slowly taken over his body. But his heart wasn't ready to let go, not without one last request. Max, his loyal K9 partner, the one who had stood by him through every dangerous pursuit, every perilous mission, he needed to be by his side again. As Mark's condition worsened, his family fought tirelessly to make it happen. But hospital rules, policies, and even doctors said it was impossible. No animals in the ICU. The clock was ticking, and time was running out. Still, Mark's family wasn't about to let his last wish go unfulfilled. What happened next would defy all odds, break hearts, and change everything forever, because some bonds, no matter what, can never be broken. Officer Mark Williams wasn't just another lawman. He was a symbol of strength, honor, and loyalty. A man who gave his all every single day in the service of his community. His partner, Max, wasn't just a dog. He was his best friend, his confidant, the one constant in an ever-changing world. Together, they were an unstoppable team, capable of tackling situations that would make most people turn away in fear. Mark and Max's journey had begun years earlier when Mark was assigned his first K9 partner. It wasn't long before the bond between them grew stronger than anyone could have imagined. They'd gone through it all: violent standoffs, high-speed chases, and countless hours spent training together in the harshest conditions. Max was more than just a police dog. He was Mark's partner in every sense of the word. Through the years, their connection deepened. When Mark faced difficult cases, Max was always there, a calming presence by his side. When the streets grew dangerous and Mark's life was at risk, Max never hesitated. They saved each other time and again. Mark knew that no matter what, Max would never leave his side, and Mark never left Max's. But now, things had changed. Mark's once strong frame was weakened and his body had been ravaged by a cruel illness. What started as a slow decline had rapidly turned into something far more serious. Doctors had given Mark only a few months to live. His family watched helplessly as the vibrant, active man they'd known slowly slipped away. In his final days, Mark had one wish, a simple yet profound request. He wanted to see Max again. Mark's family knew how much this dog meant to him. Max wasn't just a partner, he was a piece of Mark's soul, a part of the man that had made him who he was. The thought of Mark passing without seeing Max one last time seemed unbearable. But it wasn't going to be easy. Hospital rules were strict, and Max, as a K9 officer, was considered an animal in the eyes of the institution. The family fought relentlessly to bring Max to the hospital, but each attempt seemed to hit a brick wall. Time was running out, and with each passing hour, the chance of fulfilling Mark's last wish seemed less and less likely. Yet, despite the impossible odds, Mark's family refused to give up. They knew that this was the only thing left that could bring Mark peace in his final moments. They would stop at nothing to make sure Mark's wish to see his loyal K9 partner Max came true. As the days passed, Mark's health continued to deteriorate. The once strong, muscular frame of a seasoned officer had now become frail and weak. His body, ravaged by the disease, could barely keep up with the demands of life. The pain was constant, a dull ache in his bones, a sharp reminder that time was slipping away faster than anyone had hoped. His family watched in silence, knowing that the end was near. But Mark wasn't thinking about his own suffering. His mind kept drifting to one single thought: his K9, Max. Max had been his constant companion through thick and thin. Mark had saved lives, but Max had saved him more times than he could count. It wasn't just about the bond between a handler and his dog. It was a friendship forged in the heat of battle, one that couldn't be broken by time or circumstance. But now, in the face of this insurmountable illness, the one thing Mark wanted more than anything was to see Max again. Every time Mark tried to speak, his voice came out in a rasp. He'd ask his wife, Sarah, if they'd made any progress on bringing Max in, and every time she'd have to break the news. "We're working on it, Mark. They're doing everything they can," she'd say, holding his hand tightly, her eyes filled with a mix of love and helplessness. But it wasn't easy. The hospital had strict policies, and as much as the family tried to plead their case, the answer was always the same: no dogs in the ICU. Even a special request couldn't break the rules. Mark was a hero, yes, but this was a hospital, and hospitals had their own set of laws that didn't bend easily. It felt like the walls were closing in on them. The family didn't stop fighting, though. Sarah made phone calls to doctors, to administrators, even to people she didn't know, hoping that someone, anyone, would understand. But every effort seemed to fall short. The doctors kept explaining that it wasn't just a matter of hospital policy, it was about the health risks, the liability. Bringing Max in could endanger Mark's already fragile health. The family was caught in a struggle that felt too big for them to handle. Mark, on the other hand, grew more distant each day. He no longer had the energy to argue or even plead. The disease had stolen so much from him already, but it hadn't stolen his memories. At night, when the pain seemed to ease just a little, he would lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and think of Max. He remembered their first meeting, the way Max had looked at him with those intelligent eyes as if he understood that they were meant to be a team. He remembered the long nights spent patrolling the streets together when they'd be the only ones awake, navigating the darkness side by side. There was something comforting about having Max by his side, something that made the world feel a little safer. And he remembered the time Max had saved his life. The bullet that was meant for Mark had hit Max instead, and Mark had held his K9 partner in his arms as they rushed to the hospital. Max had survived that day. His tough, loyal partner had pulled through. Mark had never once questioned Max's devotion. Now, Mark was the one who was dying, and the one thing he wanted most was to see the dog who had given him everything. Sarah tried to keep hope alive. She knew how much this meant to him, and the thought of Mark passing without seeing Max one last time tore her apart. But the reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. As the days passed, she could see Mark slipping further away. The life in his eyes was fading, his energy diminishing with each hour. There was no time left. They had to act fast. In one final attempt, Sarah called every contact she could think of, from local law enforcement officers to even the head of the K9 unit. Desperation drove her to send emails, make calls, and beg for help. It felt like the world was against them, but she wasn't about to give up. Not when Mark's final wish hung in the balance. The days stretched on, each one seeming longer than the last, as the Williams family tried everything they could to get Mark's final wish fulfilled. Sarah, driven by love and desperation, pushed harder than ever. She didn't care about the rules anymore. If the hospital wouldn't let Max in through normal channels, then she'd find another way. She called in every favor, pulled every string, even reached out to the local K9 unit again, hoping someone, anyone, would understand the significance of this moment. "Please," Sarah pleaded one morning over the phone. "This isn't just about a dog. It's about a man who gave everything for this community. You can't let him go without this one final moment. He deserves it." Her voice broke on the last word, but she held her ground. The person on the other end of the line hesitated. The rules were clear, and they knew the risks. But there was something in Sarah's tone, the rawness of her plea, that made the operator pause. "I'll see what I can do," came the reply, but Sarah knew it wasn't a guarantee. Days passed, and with each one, Mark's condition worsened. His body had grown so weak that even lifting his arms seemed like a monumental effort. The pain was constant, gnawing at him, but he rarely showed it, not wanting to add more weight to the worry his family already carried. His thoughts, though, were never far from Max. Even as his body failed him, his mind refused to give up the idea of seeing his K9 partner again. In the quiet of the hospital room, when Sarah would sit by his side, Mark would softly speak about Max. His voice was a whisper, but the words still carried a depth of love that no disease could take away. "Do you remember the first time I met him?" Mark asked, looking at Sarah with tired eyes. "That look he gave me, like he knew. We were supposed to be a team. It wasn't just training, it was destiny, I guess." Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. She remembered that day all too well, the way Max had immediately bonded with Mark, how the dog had picked up on his scent and his demeanor, how they'd moved in sync from the very first moment. "That dog's been through everything with me, Sarah. He's seen me at my best, my worst, never judged, just always there." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at her husband. She wanted so badly to give him what he asked for. She wished she could break every rule, every restriction, just to make him happy one last time. But the walls were still up. The doctor's resistance was growing, their explanations more forceful, and the hospital's policies remained unwavering. "We're trying, Mark," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We're doing everything we can. Please, don't give up on us." Mark smiled faintly, but it was clear he was growing more tired with each passing moment. His once steady hands trembled and his eyes seemed distant, as though they were searching for something beyond the walls of the room, something just out of reach. "Don't you worry," he said softly, trying to comfort her even as he struggled. "If I can't see him, I know he'll be okay. He's strong. He's always been strong." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up yet. Every conversation with the doctors and hospital administrators left her feeling more helpless, but she kept pushing, relentless in her determination. Time was running out. Meanwhile, Max had no idea of the turmoil that was unfolding. To him, life had stayed the same. He woke up every morning, as always, and waited for Mark to come home. When Mark's absence became longer than usual, Max grew restless. His routine had been disrupted, and he sensed something was wrong. Max spent his days pacing in the yard, his usual alertness replaced with confusion. He refused to leave the front door, staring out the window, ears perked at the sound of every car that passed by, hoping it was Mark. He knew something was wrong, but the uncertainty of it made him anxious. The bond between a handler and his canine partner is not just a professional one. It's something much deeper, built on trust, loyalty, and mutual understanding. Mark and Max had been partners for years, sharing a bond forged in the heat of danger and honed by the passing of time. Max had been there for Mark through countless arrests, high-speed chases, and dangerous situations. But it wasn't just the badge that had bonded them. It was the unspoken connection they shared, the knowing glances and the silent communication. Max knew Mark better than anyone else. He knew when Mark was stressed, when he was happy, when he was angry, even when he was sad. From Max's perspective, the absence of his handler was like a deep ache in his chest, an emptiness he couldn't understand. He would lie by the door at night, his head resting on his paws, listening for the sound of Mark's footsteps. But they never came. Max was the one who had been there when Mark had been shot on duty, when Mark had pulled him out of harm's way, and when they had both faced their darkest moments together. Now, all Max wanted was the chance to be by his side again. The dog didn't understand why Mark hadn't come home yet, but he could sense that something was wrong. As Sarah sat beside Mark in the hospital, she could see the fatigue in his eyes, the struggle to stay awake, and the way he searched the room as though he were looking for something he could no longer find. She wished with all her heart that she could fix it, but she couldn't. The clock was ticking. Max needed to come to Mark. It was the only thing that could give Mark the peace he longed for, and Sarah knew that, deep down, Mark had given up on everything but seeing Max one last time. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, a breakthrough came, an unexpected call. The phone call came unexpectedly. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when she recognized the number on the caller ID. It was the hospital, but this time it was someone different, the director of the ICU. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Mrs. Williams?" The voice on the other end began, sounding unusually calm. "We've spoken to the medical board, and after reviewing your request, under special circumstances, we've decided to make an exception." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You're saying?" "We're going to allow Max to visit, but it has to be now, and there are strict guidelines. He'll only be allowed in for a brief period, and we'll need to monitor the situation closely. Are you prepared for that?" "I'll do anything," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't dare let them fall. This was the moment they had been fighting for. This was it. The nurse on the other end assured her that the arrangements were being made, and within the hour Sarah and the family were preparing for the arrival of Max. Mark's condition had worsened since yesterday, and they knew they were running out of time. But now, everything had changed. This could be Mark's final chance to say goodbye to his most loyal companion. As Sarah rushed to the hospital with Max, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She could hardly believe it was finally happening. She knew this moment would be one for the ages, one that would forever be etched in her memory, in Mark's memory. She called ahead to the hospital, ensuring that Max would be ready and waiting for them at the entrance. The air in the hospital was thick with tension. Mark, unaware that Max was about to be brought to him, lay in bed, his breathing shallow. His eyes flickered open as Sarah entered the room, and for a moment a small spark of recognition flashed in his gaze. "Sarah?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is everything okay?" She smiled softly, taking his hand. "Everything's going to be okay, Mark. Just rest for a moment, all right? Something very special is happening right now." Mark looked confused for a second, but Sarah didn't have the heart to explain. She didn't want to ruin the surprise. She squeezed his hand gently, comforting him in his pain, trying to steady her own nerves as she waited. Minutes felt like hours. Then the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Sarah's heart raced. She stood up, moving towards the door, and then she saw it. Max. Max's handler, a fellow officer from the K9 unit, walked through the door, his steps slow and deliberate. But it wasn't the officer that caught Sarah's attention. It was the dog. Max, the strong, loyal K9, entered the room with his head held high, his tail wagging slightly. His eyes immediately locked onto Sarah, and for a brief moment, everything felt still. Max didn't need to be told where to go. He moved with purpose, his eyes searching the room for the one person he had been waiting for. Mark's condition had left him weak, but when he saw Max, something inside him seemed to awaken. The faintest of smiles spread across his face, his lips trembling slightly as he tried to sit up. "Max," Mark whispered, the words barely escaping him. But they were enough. Max bounded towards the bed with a quiet urgency, as though he knew time was precious. He stopped just beside Mark's bed, standing still for a moment, his large brown eyes filled with an emotion that only dogs truly understand. Pure, unconditional love. Max's tail wagged slowly as he leaned in, his nose nuzzling Mark's hand. Mark's fingers trembled as he reached out weakly, gently stroking Max's fur. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked at the dog, his dog. The dog that had been his partner for so many years, who had stood by him through every difficult moment, through every crisis, through every shift. For a moment, Mark forgot about the pain, forgot about the tubes, the machines, the struggle of his body. He was simply there, in that space, with his dog, his best friend. A single tear escaped Mark's eye as he tried to smile, but it was a smile tinged with sorrow. Max, sensing the depth of the moment, sat down beside the bed, never once taking his eyes off Mark. The room was silent except for the quiet sound of Mark's breathing and the soft panting of Max, who laid his head on Mark's lap. The bond between them was palpable, thick in the air, as though it had filled the room for all the years they had been together. Sarah stood at the side, her heart breaking but also swelling with love for the two of them. She watched the scene unfold before her. Mark, weakened by illness but full of love, and Max, ever faithful, ever loyal, offering comfort in a way only he could. This was more than just a reunion. It was the culmination of a lifetime of shared experiences, of silent conversations, of moments of pure understanding. Mark stroked Max's fur slowly, the rhythm of his hand calm and steady. Every stroke seemed to carry with it 1,000 unspoken words, memories of their time together. Max closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that he was where he needed to be. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside the hospital room had faded away. There was no disease, no fear, no ticking clock. There was only this moment, this beautiful, heart-wrenching moment. "Thank you," Mark whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible, but the gratitude in it was undeniable. "Thank you for everything, Max." Max didn't need words to understand. He licked Mark's hand gently, nuzzling his face into the crook of Mark's arm, seeking comfort just as much as Mark did. The bond between them, forged in moments of joy and moments of danger, had reached its peak. It was a bond that could not be broken by time, illness, or death. As Sarah stood there, witnessing the love between Mark and Max, she knew that this was what Mark had needed most. He had fought for this moment, and now it was his. The room was filled with silence, except for the soft sounds of the breathing machines and the quiet rustle of Max's fur against Mark's hand. The love they shared was tangible, real, and in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as though even the world itself recognized the beauty of this final goodbye. The moments that followed were the last, but they were filled with everything that Mark had ever hoped for. He lay there in his bed, his hand resting gently on Max's fur, his heart full of love, his mind at peace. There were no more words left between them, just the deep silence that only true companionship can create. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that carried with it a lifetime of shared memories and unspoken understanding. Max had stayed by Mark's side the entire time, not leaving him for a second. The dog's presence was a comfort that Mark had yearned for, a connection that went beyond words. Every time Mark's fingers brushed through Max's fur, it was as if time stood still. Each stroke seemed to say everything they had never been able to put into words: the loyalty, the protection, the countless moments of joy they had shared. It was as if the bond they shared was alive, pulsing in the room, holding them both together in this final moment. Sarah stood at the side, watching her husband and their dog. There were no tears left to shed, just an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had known, deep in her heart, that Mark had needed this, needed to see Max one last time, needed to say goodbye in his own way. And now, with Max beside him, she could see the peace that had settled over Mark. The battle had been long and the pain had been unbearable at times, but now there was nothing but calm. "Thank you for letting me see him," Mark whispered, his voice frail but steady. "Thank you, Sarah, for making this happen. I needed this." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes moist with quiet emotion. "You deserve it, Mark. You deserve everything." Max, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up, his head gently nudging Mark's hand. Mark's fingers tightened around Max's fur, and for a moment it felt as if the world outside the hospital room had faded away entirely. It was just the three of them, Mark, Max, and Sarah. The rest of the world could wait. There was nothing more important than this final moment. Mark closed his eyes, his breath becoming slower, his pulse faint. But he was at peace. This was what he had needed to feel whole again, to feel at peace with everything he had faced. And now, with Max by his side, he could face whatever came next, without fear, without regret. For Sarah, this moment would remain in her heart forever. Watching her husband, the man who had been her rock for so many years, peacefully slipping away with his best friend beside him, she felt a bittersweet gratitude. The world would be a little less bright without Mark's presence, but she knew that in his last moments he had found everything he needed. His final wish had been granted, and that gave her solace. Mark's breathing grew shallow, and there was a stillness in the air that no one could ignore. Max lay back down beside him, his head resting on the bed, eyes alert, but his body relaxed. It was clear that Max, too, was waiting for Mark to finish his journey, waiting for the moment when they would no longer need to be together on this earth. It wasn't goodbye yet, but it was close. Then, as the minutes stretched into hours, Mark's breathing slowed, and the room grew quiet. There was no sound except for the soft hum of the medical equipment and the gentle rustling of Max's fur as he shifted beside Mark. Sarah's hand never left Mark's, her fingers intertwined with his, holding on to the man she had loved for so many years. She knew what was coming, and though her heart ached, she felt a sense of peace as well. This was how it was supposed to be. Mark had fought long enough, and now he could rest. At 3:32 in the morning, Mark Williams, father, husband, officer, and friend, took his final breath. The room was still. The only sounds were the soft sniffles from the family who had gathered in the hallway, the distant murmur of voices, and the steady breath of Max as he lay beside Mark, ever watchful, ever loyal. Mark had passed on, but not without peace. His last wish had been fulfilled. He had seen his partner, his best friend, one last time. Sarah gently placed her hand on Mark's chest and whispered a soft prayer. She didn't cry anymore. There was no need to. She had said goodbye in her own way, and now she could feel the warmth of his love in the room, in the silence that remained. Max stood up and walked to the door of the room, turning back once more to look at his owner. He looked at Sarah with quiet understanding, his tail wagging gently before he walked out of the room, as if sensing that it was time for him to leave as well. He had done his duty. He had given his loyalty to Mark until the very end. And now he would go. But even after Max left, the room still felt full of the memories, full of the love that had been shared, and full of the bond between a man and his dog, a bond that could never be broken, not by time, not by death. As Sarah stood there, holding onto Mark's hand for just a little longer, she knew that she would be okay. The pain would always be there, but the memories of this day, the day Mark had seen Max one last time, would carry her through. The love between them, between Mark and Max, would never fade. It would live on in her heart, in the hearts of their children, and in the hearts of everyone who had ever witnessed their bond. And so, with the peace of knowing that Mark's final wish had been fulfilled, Sarah stood tall, ready to face the world without him, but with his spirit beside her always. The bond between Mark and Max shows us just how powerful love and loyalty can be. It's a reminder that the people, and pets, we hold close deserve our time, our care, and our attention. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, share your own experiences, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this. Life is short, so cherish every moment with those you love. Thank you for watching.